Well, welcome to the Stronger Connections Grant Awardee Kickoff, and congratulations. We at TEA and at TCSS have been very eager to get to this point in the grant where we can welcome the districts who were awarded the SCG and kind of give you some updates and next steps and kind of look at the overall framework and goals that we have for the grant. We will, there we go ahead and get started with a welcome. So hi, I'm Sarah McCaslin and I'm the Stronger Connections Grant Specialist, and we'll be communicating with you guys or your SCG representatives probably very frequently over the next couple of years. And then also on the call who's able to chat is Hank, and I'll let him introduce himself as well quickly before we get going.
Hello, good morning. I am Hank Weichert. I am the Director of Student Supports Implementation at TEA, and I'm overseeing this project that is being led by Ms. McCaslin here. So thank you for attending. Thank you for applying. We are super excited to get started to be able to support students in your districts so that we can better meet their needs and improve the school experience and academic outcomes for all students.
Amy Blakey is our Director of Safe and Supportive Schools. She's also very invested in this project. And then we have a Stronger Connections Data Project Manager and a Stronger Connections Data Specialist, Tanisha and Derek, who have also been hired on the TEA side of the team to support this work. And in their cases, especially when it comes to the tons and tons of data sources that we will eventually be collecting through this project. We also wanted to give a welcome on behalf of our Texas Center for Student Support team. They aren't in a host function, so they can't come on and say hi. But as you can see, they have built their team up substantially. Robin Terry is the coordinator for the Texas Center for Student Supports. And then, of course, the rest of the people that are listed on this slide are also supporting the project in various capacities. So on behalf of the TCSS, welcome. They are also just as eager to start working with you guys, learning from you guys, and getting a lot accomplished over the next couple of years of this grant. Okay, so norms for today. We ask that you use the Q&A function to submit your questions. So I think you do have the opportunity to send chat messages to hosts and panelists. And we will do our best to monitor that side of things as well. But if you can put them all in the Q&A function so that we can give you answers in time, and so that we can also put together a post FAQ after today's webinar and after Friday's webinar as well. A recording and a slide deck of today's presentation or Friday's presentation will both be available to anyone who registered for this webinar, to any of the lead Stronger Connections grant contacts that are identified, and then also to any of the contacts that were on the original grant application. So we're going to try and streamline through all of those avenues to make sure that these materials are accessible to your districts, especially as some of you are still trying to identify who those project leads might be. Again, the chat function is available, but please use the Q&A feature to submit questions. And then I think towards the end of this webinar, we will see. There might be a time for a short Q&A where we can have you raise hands and unmute to ask questions. We'll kind of gauge that appropriately. But again, your best bet is to put them in the Q&A. And our contact information will be available at the conclusion of this as well. And we are at your disposal to make sure that you guys are on the right track. Okay, so speaking of the right track, we want to make sure that at the end of today's webinar, these objectives are met. So participants will have understanding of the Stronger Connections grant, as well as the Texas Center for Student Support's goals and objectives. We know a lot more now than we did even when you guys were applying. And so we want to be able to catch everybody up and make sure everybody knows what to expect moving forward. The second objective is that participants will feel confident entering the program negotiation stage of this grant cycle. And then also confident as you guys approach the budget workbook that you guys will be submitting on behalf of this grant as well. And then the last objective is that participants will have clear expectations for next steps and action items through the Stronger Connections grant. All right. So we broke up the session in 3 different sections. I will say there's a lot of information. You will definitely leave being tired of hearing my voice, and so will I. But we're going to start with an overview and updates. Then we'll work our way into negotiations and budgeting. And then finally, we'll share those next steps and action items, as well as kind of a timeline of deliverables for the immediate following months. And again, I just want to reiterate, a slide deck will be available, a recording will be available, and then a post webinar FAQ will be available as well. So don't feel the need to, furiously take notes or anything. We'll make sure that you have the materials you need to kind of progress through these next steps. Okay. So we want to start with the purpose of the Stronger Connections grant. And really, it's to provide schools with an opportunity to improve their approaches to supporting non-academic students. And ultimately, this will provide safe and inclusive learning environments, which we also know is a precursor for ensuring that academic needs of students are met as well. And we kind of broke this up into 3 main chunks. Through the Stronger Connections grant, you'll have access to a whole suite of training and supports from the Texas Center of Student Supports. And we'll dive into that here in a second. You will also eventually have access to a local level case management tool for identifying struggling students, tracking their progress through tailored services and supports. This is a huge piece of the project that we're working on right now with our data specialists, with TCSS, with some external vendors, to make sure we solicit the right people to help us build the best tool for case management that serves your needs, that doesn't burden the teachers, and that ultimately gives us access to a holistic picture of where students are at and what we can do to measure progress through services that we know will support those non-academic needs. And then finally, you have access to funding that we hope will support mental health personnel and contracted providers. That's been a big request through grant funds that we've seen through the application so far. And then any other additional services and tools that you guys need to address those identified needs that you named in your application as well. Here in a second, we'll look at a graphic of the for student supports and all of the moving pieces that kind of work together to support the TCSS. But I did want to name some high-level accomplishments so far so that you guys had an idea of what the TCSS has been working on since July of this year. So a big part of the TCSS is incorporating stakeholder feedback. And they've done this through establishing a lot of advisory groups. So we've got advisory groups that focus on community partnerships. This is like research institutions, nonprofits, organizations, that sort of thing, to kind of bring in that expert knowledge. They also have advisory groups for our ESC representatives. So luckily we have a Stronger Connections grant representative stationed at all 20 of our ESCs. We also have advisory groups that pull together district and campus level leadership, as well as teachers from across the state. And then we will eventually, through the TCSS, have a student advisory committee as well, that brings in that very, very important piece of knowledge and that sort of level of stakeholder engagement. They're also working on building frameworks. So 2 huge pieces of the Texas Center for Student Support of their grant is to develop a student support framework that can be established at all of our participating Stronger Connections grant districts. We know that that means a certain level of tailoring to fit, your local needs. But developing that kind of plug and play framework for districts who might be at different levels of what their student support framework looks like right now. Being, we're at the ground level, we need help from the get-go, or we already have great systems in place that we just need to tailor and modify to kind of support the overall framework that TCSS will support. And then secondly, they'll also be developing the parent and family engagement playbook. And so really just a set of standards, best practices, resources, modules, trainings that really focus on the parent and family engagement piece of this grant work, because without that piece, we'd probably be at a standstill for a very long time. So those frameworks are underway. And then we've also established partnerships with the University of Texas Behavior and Policy Institute, and then the University of Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health. Those acronyms might not be perfect, but those are two of the partnerships that TCSS has cultivated so far. And they'll be providing a whole slew of knowledge and wealth of resources for us to tap into and for you guys to tap into as well. This visual attempts to kind of streamline, like I said, all of the moving pieces. So we have the Texas Center for Student Supports that's standing up these frameworks, but we have a whole circle of people that are supporting that work. So we've got the Behavioral Science Institute, we've got the Institute for Excellence in Mental Health. There will eventually be additional external vendors that are vetted and incorporated into this framework. Really, the Texas Center for Student Supports has really been cultivated not to create resources, but to curate them. And so with your assistance as well, we're hoping to find the best of the best vendors, contracted providers, those kinds of things to come in and fill in some of the missing pieces and figure out the best way that they can continue to support the work that you guys will start doing or have been doing. We've got regional ESC support. We've got the case management system that will eventually be pulled into this. And then we've got you guys with the Stronger Connections grant, who are piloting these partnerships with the TCSS and helping kind of solidify these frameworks and concepts that we've been building up until this point. And then the Texas Center for Student Supports kind of names 5 different areas that they really want to pour into over the next couple of years. Developing the student support program framework, curating professional learning content, establishing advisory and focus groups. They've got the parent and family engagement playbook piece, and then data reporting is a huge part of this as well, both through the case management tool, but also just the efficacy of how we're spending funds, how we're connecting those dollars to the work, and the overall improvements that we're making to the, stronger connections that we want to be building locally in our schools. Okay. So that's kind of an overview and update, and I want to move on to program negotiations and budgeting. So I don't think it's a surprise, given the dates that had previously been posted on our awardee grant website. We're working with our budgeting department now to officially approve an extension of the Stronger Connections grant. This extension would have a proposed end date of September 30th, 2026. So originally applicants were applying for a grant that would sustain this work through 2025. Right now, we're finalizing and kind of going through, the back end procedures of approving that extension for another year. Regardless of the next steps on that extension, granted, I know that impacts a lot of this work. So we're gonna, make sure we walk you guys through that appropriately. Even in the original program guidelines that had September 30th, 2025 as our end date, the remainder of this school year, 23-24, has always been marked as a planning phase, because we knew that TCSS would be releasing a wealth of information and resources districts would be navigating payroll, contracted services, and then kind of figuring out where their identified needs kind of fit into these services and provisions that TCSS will have. So under the original end date of 2025 and under this potential end date of 2026, the remainder of this school year, we really want to function as a great planning year for you guys. With that being said, moving into 24-25, some of that planning might continue, and we want districts to have the flexibility to take the time that they need to do meaningful work from the get-go. But then 24-25 would move into an implementation year one. This is when payroll and contracted services would begin. And then again, pending that extension being finalized, the 25-26 school year would roll into an implementation of year two, where payroll and contracted services would continue. And we'll talk more specifically about kind of the impacts of those two timelines here in a second. The next note that we wanted to give you, vendors are eager and they are very, very aware of the Stronger Connections grant money that's out there and the work that you guys are going to start doing very soon. And they've already reached out to us at TEA very frequently about those grant funds. We really want to encourage you guys to be mindful that the TCSS is developing a mandatory set of trainings that coincide with that student support framework they're building, that coincide with the parent and family engagement playbook, and that also coincide with the services that our two UT partnerships are going to offer as well. And those would be at no cost to you guys. And so what we would love to do is to have districts wait until those frameworks and those partnerships and those trainings have been finalized next spring. And then we can start to plug in, or you guys can start to plug in locally where there might be any additional gaps in training or any additional capacity builders that you guys need to meet those individual identified needs that you guys put in your application, so that you have all of the resources needed to tackle the various, levers that you've identified or capacity building opportunities. But again, with TCSS developing and leading those frameworks and providing a lot of that content for us at no cost, and wanting to make sure that there is a streamlined approach that districts are taking to student support programs and student support teams. There's really no need to jump the gun and to rush out of the gate, especially during this planning phase, hiring those contracted services and partnering with those vendors. And we want TCSS to be able to establish a protocol for vetting those vendors. That way, those vendors fit in, and what the vendor is asking you to do matches overall what the TCSS student support framework, student support team structure, and parent and family engagement playbook is asking you guys to do, so that there's no wasted time, wasted money, resources, effort, that sort of thing. With that being said, there will be an opportunity if you guys have worked with certain providers before, and we have tons that we've pulled from the application as well. Like if you've listed a certain kind of SEL curriculum, or if you've listed a certain kind of survey or additional tool that you've used to address this grant work in the past, we've pulled together a list of that, but then there will also be an opportunity for you to submit those proposed kind of contracted services or vendors that you want to partner with to the TCSS, so that we can generally vet them again against that student support framework and parent and family engagement playbook, to make sure that that vendor is going to get you ultimately to where you need to go. So we want to make sure that we're taking into account who you guys have used locally in the past, or who you found and you want to, have a partnership with. But that again, it fits under this larger umbrella of what TCSS is developing. So for negotiations and kind of general tips for budgeting, Everyone will participate in program negotiations. There were some applications where no notes were made from program. However, everybody is responsible for completing that budget workbook. So in some instances, there may be a couple of application questions where we would like the preliminary awardee to go back in and address it. And then everybody will have the chance to get their full-on budget workbook, and kind of plug in the expenses that you guys are anticipating over the cycle of the grant. Okay, so a couple of things to be mindful of during negotiations and as you guys are doing those budgets. Connecting dollars to the work is essential. And so we want to make sure that every expenditure that is reflected in your budget is reasonable and necessary to carry out the goals of the grant. So make sure during the season of like coming back into negotiations, maybe it's been a while since your district applied. Well, I mean, that's true for all of us. Maybe it's been a while since your district has looked at those program guidelines. Maybe staff has turned over and we have had changes in leadership and who's going to be leading this work. So with those kind of variables in mind, make sure that you're familiar with those goals of the Stronger Connections grant, because we want those expenditures to aim to address those responses that you guys are providing to non-academic needs and those like preventative measures that you anticipate putting in place to capture those, preemptive services that we're giving to students to address emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs. This is not a school safety grant. Those exist and are out there, and we would be more than willing to point you in the right direction of some of those available grants that tackle those important aspects of school safety. But that's not necessarily aligned to the specific goals of this grant. And then we also just want to make sure that we're walking the line of supplement, not supplant, as best we can, knowing that, post House Bill 3, there's, a different set of local and state minimums that districts should abide by, where our Stronger Connections grant just can't legally, supplement that work. So with that being said, some of the most notable unallowable costs that we've seen identified in your applications up until this point are things like security officers, police officers, SROs to meet state minimum requirements, guards, security hardware or equipment, or any kind of training that's related to those state minimums. So some examples are like getting those behavioral threat assessment trainings or getting trainings to meet state minimum standards for bullying. Those are two more frequent examples that we saw. Those things are fantastic. Those things coincide with our objectives and goals of the Stronger Connections grant. But because of supplement, not supplant, and again, because of really aiming to address emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs, those are not allowable costs. That was named in the FAQ that was released back when we were having Stronger Connections grant informational webinars. So if you go to the grant opportunities page, you can find that FAQ, and it does name some of those unallowable costs there. We'll also have like a budget guidance document that's available to you all during program negotiations to kind of help aid you in the right direction with what you can and cannot purchase through the funds of this grant. Again, we're not very prescriptive, but there are, because of supplement, not supplant, just some immediate no's that we've provided. And then we did catch, we assume, hopefully 100% of those in your initial budget proposals that you put in your original application. So if you did name any of these unallowable costs, then you should see a note left on your application during negotiations. So that way you know not to include that expenditure in your budget workbook and kind of reallocate those funds as you see fit. Capital outlay. Please, again, check your negotiation notes. If you did leave an expense for capital outlay, we either said, no, this is unallowable, in accordance with what USDE federal funding says is just flat out unallowable. Or there were some instances where the description of your capital outlay purchase was fantastically woven into your narrative. We understood how it how it will meet the identified need of your campus. So we gave it, a check mark, you're good to go. Or there was the middle ground where the application question, we could kind of interpret how it might be beneficial to the outcomes of this grant, but we asked you to further elaborate on how that expense would support carrying out the goals of this grant and how it would be reasonable and necessary to the identified needs that were put on your application. So just read those notes carefully, because when you put those expenses into your budget workbook, grants administration will send us those workbooks that do have capital outlay requests, so that program can make final approval. And we just want to make sure that we have access to that clarification before approval is made. So just review those comments and make sure that they're incorporated back into your application, so that we can ensure that the purchase, again, is just streamlined with the goals of the grant. Okay, I think we're over halfway. Again, this is very information intensive, and so my apologies. But we're just going to keep chugging along. If you joined late, you will have access to this slide deck, access to this recording, access to an FAQ, and then I will be at your disposal as well to answer any questions. So just wanted to plug that in there again for anybody who might be, transcribing everything I'm saying. We wanted to touch on payroll as you guys are integrating that into your budget. If you have something like a project director or grant and data support staff, those are positions that you might want to start hiring for now because of the work of the grant starts now, or especially moving into the spring semester. However, again, when we look at how the 23-24 school year had been even originally designated as a planning phase, and how with the extension of the grant potentially getting us another year to expend all of our funds, we really want to, again, pump the brakes on hiring positions that are related to counselors, mental health care contractors, those sorts of things. That way it allows you guys to potentially budget those positions across the 24-25 and 25-26 school year, but also so that, again, we have a designated time and space to build internal systems, to meet the training requirements from the TCSS, to incorporate those frameworks and playbooks and set of standards that they're providing, and integrate those kind of best practices into our campuses before we start moving into those payroll expenditures. So just something to be mindful of. If you did not already budget for some kind of project director or grant, kind of leadership and oversight, whether that's in the form of a stipend to existing staff or whether that's hiring somebody outside, we would encourage districts to consider that if it's not going to compromise how you tackle the identified needs that have already been named. Meaning, if your identified needs require you spending the majority of your funds on other services, then this is certainly not a payroll item you need to prioritize, but it is allowable. And we've had some questions recently come in, and so I wanted to address that now. So really just talk about it with leadership, talk about the needs that you've addressed and that you named in your application, and see if something like that is beneficial. Sustainability is something that we also wanted to address under tips for budgeting. Please let sustainability drive your budget conversations. And that's a whole lot easier said than done. This line of work is very tricky because we know that you guys are also navigating Title IV Part A funding, and you're also navigating local and state minimums for the safety and security piece of this. And so we want to acknowledge that we have this money and we need to use it while we have it, because we want to impact student well-being while we have this additional source of funds. But we also want to be as forward thinking as possible when it comes to looking at what this program looks like post 2025 or post 2026. And then I also wanted to note that TCSS is prioritizing finding a technical assistance provider that can provide one-on-one coaching as needed, or even just general consulting for all of our grantees on sustainability of funds. And so helping us answer those questions like, how do we think critically about multiple funding streams? How can we take what we've learned from ESSER and apply that here? What are like some strategic ways that we can think about tackling some of our goals now with the money that we have, but how we can be planning for not necessarily having that income in 2 years. And so we will have kind of outside counsel and technical assistance that will be available to you guys as needed. And so I just wanted to kind of make it a priority to say that, because we want to emphasize how sustainability of this work is very important. But we also know it can be kind of tricky and convoluted. So last thing on tips for budgeting is documentation. So the budget workbook that you receive from grants during the negotiation process will be comprehensive of the whole grant cycle. We do not know at this time if that budget workbook is going to be through a 2025 cycle or through a 2026 cycle. But as soon as we know something, you will know something. But what that means is, you know, when you're budgeting your 6,100, you're not budgeting it year over year. It'll just be one line item, right, of like the entirety of the grant. But with that being said, we encourage you to keep local documentation of how your grant funds will be spread out year over year, or even quarter over quarter, month over month. There will come a time, and we'll talk about this here in just a second, where we ask you to submit information on your quarterly spending. This is something that will align ultimately to what USDE reporting is requesting of all Stronger Connections grant recipients. And then it's also a helpful tool for us at TEA to kind of figure out where the dollars are going, what they're supporting, and kind of track that over time, those overtime expenses. So again, the budget workbook that you receive will be comprehensive of the whole grant cycle, but please keep local documentation. It'll save you a few steps of what your budget might look like on a more frequent cadence, so that we can be able to document that as we see fit moving forward. Not that you're tied, right, to the budget. We know that this kind of work will require a certain level of flexibility and pivoting. So nobody's asking you to, like, you know, sign and date it in blood or anything. But it will be helpful just to kind of proactively plan going into the grant cycle. Okay. Negotiations timeline, I'll review this pretty quickly and we'll move on to the last pieces of this. Competitive review of all of the applications concluded mid-October. So again, congratulations. We're very excited to welcome you into the TCSS Stronger Connections grant family of sorts. Preliminary award notifications were posted November 1st. We, on the program side of things at TEA, completed our program negotiations. So essentially just making notes in your application. We completed those November 3rd. And so we are working on solidifying a timeline of when you guys will start to receive those program negotiations. Again, with reemphasizing that the 23-24 school year is a planning phase. We don't feel behind in this work. Nobody's worried or stressed or that sort of thing. We're not gonna, you know, take our time for the sake of taking time. But hopefully sometime this month in November. We expect those external program negotiations to be sent to you guys. A lot of that also depends on how this extension comes into play. And so we just want to make sure that we're not asking you to duplicate any efforts. So as soon as we can finalize things internally, which we all very well know, at a state agency, sometimes it just takes a little bit extra time. Then external program negotiations will start with you. You'll get your next steps, you'll get your comments to respond to, you'll get your budget workbook, and you'll be well on your way. NOGAs will be released upon successful completion of those negotiations. So obviously not like a standard date right there. And then your technical grant start date is November 15th, 2023. On that same kind of front, that's kind of your negotiation timeline, which is really the next step of all of this. But we do have Stronger Connections grant programmatic deliverables that will start January. And so we kind of took the ones that are forthcoming, took the ones that we thought would be nice to document and know about as you guys are starting to plan implementation of this work. So with that being said, program negotiations are happening ASAP. With that, there are mandatory allocations that should be made to your regional ESC and to the Texas Center for Student Supports. And those are 6% of your award and 10% of your award respectively. TCSS has information, and your regional ESCs both have information on how to go about doing that, making sure that your business office is aligned with their business offices so that this doesn't have to take a bunch of your time. So that information will be provided to you as well, so that we can get those done as soon as possible. Because that will help TCSS and your regional ESCs also be able to take those funds and start turning around a lot of their deliverables as well. Recruitment of your local advisory councils, that was one of the performance measures or grant assurances that's in the SCG. That'll happen kind of January to March timeframe. So come next semester, we would love for districts to start recruiting who's going to be on those councils. TCSS will have resources on effective ways to do so, things to think about when it comes to planning advisory meetings, hosting advisory meetings, getting people to participate, timely topics, those sorts of things. So there will be resources at your disposal from TCSS that will kind of help you walk through that process. And so recruitment for those advisory councils should be January, February, and kind of concluded in March. School climate surveys will be administered February, March of next spring, so that there's an opportunity to get baseline data of those school climate surveys. More information will come from TCSS on what that survey may be. It will either fall into TCSS has provided X survey that districts will use, or TCSS has provided like a resource bank where questions and constructs and variables kind of line up on the back end so that they're all measuring the same thing. But perhaps there are, different tools that you can choose from. But more information coming. We'll make sure that you have that prior to administering those baseline surveys in the spring. And then finally, TCSS will start releasing trainings or trainer of trainers to your ESC representatives spring of 2024, and then likely into the summer of 2024 as well. And those will be related to the student support program and to family engagement as well. So just kind of some high level things to be thinking about deliverables wise. Okay. The next thing we kind of wanted to dive into, and I think this is our last chunk of information before we kind of wrap up. We want to make sure that at the end of this grant cycle, we're not just clapping because we all spent millions of dollars. but that there's a way to measure the efficacy of all this work that you guys are ultimately pouring into your campuses and districts. And then same for the TCSS and same for our team at TEA as well. And so we took the program guidelines and identified 6 performance measures that were listed in your Stronger Connections Grant Program guidelines, and have developed a Fidelity of Implementation rubric, tool, self-evaluation. You could probably call it 1,000 different things, but essentially a way to make sure that your leadership teams are asking yourselves the right questions, and really just getting a designated space to evaluate how you're progressing through the grant cycle as it relates to those 6 performance measures. So the purpose of this FOI tool is really to provide an opportunity for self-reflection, for formative and summative evaluation, and to celebrate your strengths. The more that you guys are talking about what's working, and the more we hear about it, then we can have those discussions on how, your district can replicate it locally at other campuses, but also how we can replicate it statewide. And so being able to document that is especially important in this line of work. The tool is also structured to provide in-time scaffolded supports. So if you're looking at a performance measure, and there are very few celebrations and you feel very stuck, then we want to make sure we have a clear direction of where we're going, whether that's through additional services through TCSS, additional services through us at TEA, additional services through somebody else who can provide that caliber of technical assistance to help you move forward in that performance measure. And then really by implementing this tool, districts and campus leadership should notice a stronger, more effective implementation of your identified needs and how you plan to measure those, as well as the overall goals and objectives of the grant itself. So the structure of this is that your leadership teams will meet quarterly. Your leadership teams will probably be meeting more frequently than quarterly to talk about other things, but we want to make sure that there's a designated quarterly cadence to talk about these 6 performance measures. You'll rate yourself on a scale of like 1 to 4. Based on some different performance measure criteria, like, I have done this, this, and this, or I'm still struggling here, or, this, that, and the other. And then once your leadership teams have had a chance to kind of talk about those performance measures, talk about next steps, 1, maybe 2 leadership team representatives, whoever maybe your project director is, or whoever is taking on more of that leadership and oversight, will then have a time to review that information with myself at TEA, and then also your regional ESC, Stronger Connections Grant representative, as they might be available. And this will be virtual, 30-ish minutes. We don't want to take, oodles of time, but really just to give you a dedicated space to say, yes, here's what we talked about. These are some next steps that we have. Here's how we're progressing through these performance measures. And then a chance for you to identify any additional needs that are maybe not being met, or any additional in-time supports that you might need to get farther and farther in the grant process. And then the timeline for this, your virtual calls, and then your prerequisite leadership meetings should occur quarterly. We flexed Q2 because summer is crazy, but you can expect to meet with us for the first time April of 2024. We will make sure that the actual FOI tool is sent to you in January. So you know what it looks like. You can ask questions, you can give input, make recommendations, but so that you can ultimately become familiar with those 6 performance measures and the expectations of the tool itself. And then I will very quickly name those 6 performance measures. And you guys have access to this slide deck, and you can dive into those performance measures at your leisure after this call. But essentially, you and your leadership teams will evaluate yourselves on grant management. So making sure you're on track to spend down funds, making sure you're connecting dollars to the work, and that you're ultimately in compliance with state and federal reporting requirements. The next performance measure is training and professional development. This makes sure that you are meeting those mandatory TCSS training deliverables. Your regional ESCs will have training deliverables. You might be contracting with a third-party vendor. We want to make sure that you're meeting those training deliverables as well. The third performance measure is data collection. This one makes sure that once we do have a case management tool in place, that your staff are trained, that your staff are utilizing and implementing it. And then part of the data collection piece is also participating in these quarterly FOI calls as well. Your fourth performance measure is the student support program. So really making sure that the LEA is on track to building and then eventually maintaining an effective student support program that's under the parameters of TCSS. And then that kind of program or that performance measure also encompasses the extent to which parent-family engagement is incorporated, as well as your local advisory councils as well. And then your fifth performance measure is SMART goals and benchmarks. These are things that you guys identified in your application. And we want to make sure that there's a dedicated time and place for you guys to actually evaluate those SMART goals and those benchmarks. So this performance measure allows you to track your progress to those SMART goals, and then according to the benchmarks that you guys outlined. Again, this work is flexible. This work should meet your needs. We don't really foresee anybody like totally flipping over any SMART goals, but the more you dive into this work, the more you might need to be flexible on what those SMART goals are. And so again, the FOI provides you a time and a place to kind of evaluate if that is continuing to match the identified needs of your district. If not, how can we flex and pivot? And then if it is in line with our identified needs, how are we, progressing towards our ultimate goal? And then sustainability is the last performance measure. This is really interwoven into all the other performance measures, but we want a dedicated space for you to reflect on this individually. And so this performance measure ensures that the district is integrating sustainability measures into your programmatic decisions. This really will focus on like a set of questions that you guys just ask yourselves and document answers to, because there's no right or wrong way. We might not all get the sustainability piece right, but as long as we're continuously reflecting on that, then we're moving in the right direction. So those are your performance measures. Again, more information on the FOI tool will come out in January so that you guys can be well acquainted with the tool itself. But we did want to prep you now and give you some foresight into what that self-evaluation and reflection piece kind of looks like as part of this grant. Okay, we are near the end. We have a couple of, this bar is blocking my title. I think these are action items. So first thing is look out for negotiation emails. We will have budget guidance for you in helping you name some of those explicitly unallowable costs so that nobody has to worry about it beyond the amount they should worry about it. We'll have an attachment to that email that recaps a lot of these budget and negotiation reminders. You'll have those requests that program made in your application in case you need to clarify any of your answers, add to some of your answers, adjust, those sorts of things. So that email, please be on the lookout for it. It will be very comprehensive, but it will make sure that you have a successful negotiation experience. We also wanted to take just 2 minutes, and I'm actually going to pause so that we can all take the 2 minutes to complete this Qualtrics survey. In your grant application, it's typically just the superintendent or maybe some authorized contacts that are listed, but we understand that in some cases, the superintendent and your authorized contacts may not be the direct leadership and oversight over the Stronger Connections grant program. So if you already know who that contact person will be for your district, and we understand things change, so there is an opportunity to correct this form, we would love for you to go ahead, and I think Hank, if he's available, will put the link in the chat, or you can scan this QR code in the bottom right-hand corner. It will take you very little time. We just want you to select your region, select your district, and go ahead and enter the contact information, primary and maybe secondary if you know it, of the people that we should be reaching out to, that the Texas Center for Student Support should be reaching out to for the most like in-time communication of grant deliverables. So again, not to say that your superintendents won't be involved, but they might not be providing that level of oversight that your leadership person would. So I will pause for just a second, catch my breath as well. And then we'll move through these last bullet points in just a minute or two while you guys fill that out. And if you don't know the information yet, we'll send this link at a later time. So if you need to have internal conversations over who that contact person should be, and again, there's primary and secondary, you can take some time to figure that out. But if you already know it, then we're ready to build that list. Zoom is unstable messages. So if Hank or Ashton, if you need to ping me and tell me that I'm cutting out, feel free to do that.
You're good so far.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. No problem.
I'll do one more minute and then we'll move on. And you're just filling out that Qualtrics link if you already know who your primary contact for Stronger Connections grant work will be. Okay. There will be a kickoff guide. So it really just corresponds to the information from this slide deck and recording. But there'll be a kickoff guide that we would love for you guys to review, as well as your points of contact. When you eventually have access to this slide deck, you can click there and find the contact information for your regional ESC. And so again, the recording, this slide deck, the kickoff guide, those points of contact will be available the week of November 20th. So we've got this webinar and then we've got a corresponding webinar on Friday. It's the same information. Once those two have concluded and we develop that FAQ, we'll post everything next week or send it to you directly. Reach out to info@Texas CSS, so Texas Center for Student Supports net, to name any recommendations for those vetted technical assistance providers. So if in your application you said, hey, we really want to work with X, or we really like this curriculum, or we really want this vendor, submit those to TCSS. Again, we want those to be vetted. And we want first to make sure that the trainings and suite of services that TCSS is developing is accessible to districts first, so that then you can find gaps and plug in to those areas where you might need that additional support. For questions, you can reach out to me, my director, Hank. You can reach out to info@TCSS. And then again, you'll have your regional ESC contact sheet. Between all of us, we'll make sure that your question gets answered. And whoever you're most comfortable reaching out to, we just want that to be available to you and for you to know that we're all at your disposal. And then the last thing we have, and I'm going to go out of order, is thank you. We really look forward to this partnership. And I think the more and more that we start to visit with districts, the more and more that we read your applications, we just become more and more excited for the work that you guys are planning on doing, for the work that TCSS will support, and how our team at TEA gets to play a small role in really the groundbreaking efforts that you guys are going to be participating in over the next couple of years. If you have any further questions now, put them into the Q&A, although I think those have been monitored for the most part. And again, we'll pull all of them and put them in an FAQ afterwards. And then we would love, in an effort to make sure that these kind of sessions meet your needs moving forward, if you would take just a minute or two to complete this exit ticket. We're going to drop the link to it in the chat so that you guys can click on it. We would love for you guys, there's just 3 questions, for you to fill that out so that we can make sure that these meetings meet your needs or continue to meet your needs moving forward. And that is really all I have. I say that's a lot of information, but that's all we have. We have just a couple of minutes. So I think there's a lot of answered questions on here. If your question didn't get answered, don't worry, we'll put them in an FAQ. Hank, do you know if maybe there was a theme or pattern and there's maybe 1 or 2 like high level questions you want to come off and answer for the group now? Just because we won't have enough time to do like an open mic Q&A.
Yeah, I
And
think
if they're all over the place, then
yeah, they're kind of all over the place. I think one of the ones that I saw that was kind of in a theme was it had to do with the hiring, with spending money. Did they have to wait for their negotiations? When would they get their NOGA? And could they start hiring people now? And I think that you answered that during this process and really strongly recommending that they wait and they start get into the planning process. They will have 2 full years of implementation, so there's not a hurry to get to spending the money to get folks hired. We want to make sure that we get it right and then get the right programs in place and get the right people in place.
great.
Anything else? I think the other question was about vendors, if they're already working with vendors, if they're already doing climate surveys, if they've already got vendors that they're working with, their collecting the data and monitoring and referring kiddos on. Would they have to change to the what the TCSS is developing? And I think that really depends on how closely that system aligns and what gets developed by that vendor, if it will incorporate and be able to pull in that data into that system, and that it has all of the same elements that we're looking for. So I think that's going to have to be evaluated. And I believe that the TCSS is developing a rubric to evaluate vendor products and climate surveys to make sure that they're aligned to what goes with this program.
Yeah.